In our evening Bible studies, we've been going through doing a survey of the Bible, and we're just kind of doing an overview of each book of the Bible and touching on certain points and looking at the structure and different things. But as I go through each week and I'm looking at some things, seeing some different things, reading through, because it's hard, when you think about trying to condense the contents of one book into 1 hour and trying to teach all, a summary of all that book contains, it can be quite difficult. So you've got to pick and choose about the topics and things like that, but I still have to do a lot more study and reading than just what, you get. And so one of the things is, there's pockets of things that I pick up on and read. And so, last week was an example of one of those things that we picked up on. And so this past week before last, we went through Leviticus. And one of the things about Leviticus is that it's a book that a lot of people don't read. It's often neglected. And it's a lot of times if you start reading it, it'll put you to sleep just because of the overall nature of it. And a lot of times it just seems like we're just so displaced from it, because it was, 3,500 or 3,400 years ago, give or take a few decades there. And so it's really, we're just so estranged from the law, because we're under grace that we don't like to read it too much. But we miss a lot of very important things, a lot of valuable lessons when we skip books of the Bible. And Leviticus is one that's actually, if you actually do some study on it in little bits at a time, it can be very relevant to our day and age. And so one of the things that caught my attention, and is something it's really the theme of the book. But the thing that kind of crossed my mind here is the idea of losing ground. And so what do I mean by losing ground? When you look at the world around us, even look at the church, when you look at what's all around us, what do you see? We see evil. We see sin. We see destruction. We see chaos. Do we see a lot of peace? Do we see a lot of salvation? Do we see people flocking to God like they should be? Does it look like we're losing ground? It does. Sometimes it looks like we are losing ground. And so a natural question would be this. Because we live in culture, don't we? We do. We live in culture. We have a culture here in the United States. Canada has a culture. Mexico has a culture. Everywhere you go has a culture. And so it doesn't matter where you go, anywhere in the world, at any point in history, there's always been culture. So as the church, why are we losing ground to the culture? That's a deep question. It's a very difficult question. So here's a few things, maybe just to ask, just to get us started. Is it because we don't have enough Christian movies out there? Because, there's movies all the time, every week there's a new movie that comes out. People watch TV, people go to the movies. I love going to the movies. I like going to the big screen, and, hearing great surround sound, and, sound like, you see something with a lot of car chases and you feel like the cars are driving right beside your head. We like action, some people like chick flicks. Don't try and deny it, fellas. But, we like entertainment. Back in Jesus' day, they liked entertainment. So there's nothing wrong with entertainment. But is it because we don't have enough Christian movies? Well, it certainly couldn't hurt if we had more Christian movies. But is that the answer? Not really. Is it because we don't have enough Christian politicians? Lord knows we could use a few of those. A whole bunch, yeah. But is that the answer if we have more Christian politicians? Not necessarily. Is it because we don't have enough Christian music? No. Because, it's all kinds of Christian music. Every type of genre you can think of, there's Christian music. So it's not that we don't have a plethora of types of Christian music for everybody to enjoy. Every age can enjoy Christian music. There's a gospel message in every kind of music that you can listen to. So is it because we don't have enough Christian music? Is that the answer? Not necessarily. Is it because we don't have enough Christian publications? Magazines. Now with the internet, you've got blog posts. People subscribe to blogs. People sometimes put out daily blogs. Is it because of that? Not necessarily. Or maybe it's because we don't have enough Christians. Maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. We don't have enough Christians in the culture. Or, maybe it's something else. Certainly I think our culture could use a few more Christians. It could be that we need something that is central, a central theme that runs throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And it's something that we find in the book of Leviticus. Do you know what that is? There you go. Holiness. And it comes from God. So what is holiness? Well, we can look at what Noah Webster said. He defines holy this way: properly whole, entire, or perfect in a moral sense, hence pure in heart, temper, or dispositions, free from sin and sinful affections, consecrated and set apart. When we look at what Norman Geisler, who is someone who's wrote a very definitive work, or somewhat definitive, on theology, he writes this: God's holiness means that he is separated from sin and devoted to seeking his own honor. And so what we get with holiness is someone who is pure and perfect and complete, and someone who is set apart. So you've got two different things to combine to make holiness. Now, when God used Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, because when you get to Leviticus, they're still at the base of Mount Sinai. They haven't left yet. So God keeps them there for over a year because he wants to give them something. He wants to teach them something. And so when God used Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, he had to prepare them for what was going to come. He had to prepare them to go into the land at which he was going to give them. And so the problem was, it was easier to get the Hebrews out of Egypt than it was to get Egypt out of the Hebrews. Because you got to think, for centuries, they were inundated with false gods, false practices, oppression, things that were very contrary to the nature of God himself. So the Hebrews were conditioned. They needed to be reminded of the God that they served, the God that they belonged to, the people that they were going to be set apart for. God had set this people apart to be different. And so trying to get Egypt out of the Hebrews was very difficult. It didn't take long. Even though they saw the great miracles directly coming out of Egypt, even experiencing the plagues, they saw the might of God as they left Egypt. and they came through the desert, and they got to the sea, and God miraculously opened the sea, and they went through it. And God crushed the Egyptians. He gave them food before they got to Mount Sinai. He gave them everything they needed. And so there they're sitting at Mount Sinai, and God calls Moses on the mountain to give him that great and perfect law. And while he's up there, something happens. Egypt comes back. And there at the bottom at the camp, singing and all sorts of ungodly things take place. An idol's built, no doubt. It's an idol or a god that's representative of something from Egypt, because that's all they knew. But they had just witnessed a God who took them out of all that. They just witnessed a God who set them free. But yet they went back to what they knew. And so God had to give them something. God had to give them something. And so what he gave them was holiness. He gave them an instruction manual on how to be more like him. Now, who doesn't want to be more godly? Even people who aren't Christians want to be godlike. But you got to know God, don't you? If you want to be godlike, you got to know God. You know, and he invites us. It's not like he's saying you can't be godlike. He invites us. I want you to be more like me. Think of the question I asked about what do you see around you? What do you see going on? What if people wanted to be more godlike? What do you think you would see out there? What do you think you would see in the church? Don't you think you'd see more peace, more unity? You'd see more devotion? Of course you would. So let's look at Leviticus chapter 19. Because this is really the theme. This is really what God lays down. The theme about holiness. Leviticus chapter 19. I know nobody reads Leviticus, but it's there in the front. It's right behind Exodus and right before. Leviticus chapter 19. Starting or using verses 1 and 2. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. He spoke to the people, and he told them, he said, Speak to all the people. He said, don't just speak to some of them. Speak to all of them and tell them, you shall be holy. So what he's telling them, he said, you shall be like that because I'm like that. I'm giving you the layout and the instruction manual on how to be like me. To be perfect, complete, and to be set apart. He gave them that. He instructed Moses, tell them that. And so what we read in chapter 19 is basically he gives us a summary of what God wanted the people to do. Now, the law, there's a lot of law that takes up the book of Leviticus. It also takes up the book of Numbers and also takes up the book of Deuteronomy. So there's a lot of law. But here in chapter 19, he kind of gives us a summary of what he expects. And he covers a lot of ground, a lot of different bases. And when you look through and you start reading all the things that he says here and talks about and the things that he touches on, what you figure out and what you notice is that every aspect of human life was involved with the law. So I want you to think about this for a moment. Is God in every aspect of your life? Everything that you do in your life, no matter what it is it devoted to God? I'd say for every one of us, the answer is no. And that's probably putting it mildly. The life that they lived was to be permeated in every way of living up to God's standard and expectations. How many of us are living up to God's expectations today? I know we're not. I know I'm certainly not. I've already had to apologize for something I did this morning. So we don't always live up to the expectation of what God wants us to be and the things that God wants us to do. But God expects us that every part of our life is to be permeated by His standard of living. Have any of you ever heard of George Barna? Have you ever heard of the Barna Group? It's a research group. They go through and do all these studies. They've been doing them for a long time. And they focus a lot on Christian aspects of things, but they focus on other things too. But primarily it's a good Christian source. If you want to know what Christians are saying today, what they think, things like that, through polls and stuff like that, it'll give you a pretty good temperature of what's going on. And so here's something that he said about our culture. He said, "We have not transformed our culture because we are neither grieved nor humbled by our own sin." Now think about that. We're losing ground to the culture. I think you acknowledge that, right? We're losing some ground. Could there be some merit to this? Absolutely. Do we look like a people set apart? Do we resemble a people that's holy? A lot of times we don't. And so we have not transformed our culture because we are neither grieved nor humbled by our sin. That's one of the things I like about reading early church history. Because you read of people who were dedicated to God, and every aspect of their life was dedicated to God, and you can see the commitment that they had. You can see that they dedicated every aspect of their life to the gospel. They dedicated it to Christ and His mission. They were humble. They were servants. They were not afraid to die. They were not afraid to be martyrs. And they did make a difference in culture. Because when you read through the book of Acts, thousands upon thousands of people in a very ungodly culture were converted to Christianity. It's because those people saw. They saw a people set apart. And it made a difference. They believed the message. Now, here's some of the things I want to cover this very quick. Barna, he stated this. This was the state of the church. He said, a lot of people in his poll said that faith today begins with personal felt needs and it ends with convenience and simplicity. That means people want stuff as easy as possible. They want all the rewards without having to put the work into it. Convenience and simplicity. Christians don't want anything hard. They don't want to go through anything hard. Like last week, it's much easier for somebody to compromise a little bit instead of being committed because they see something that's difficult. They don't want to face it. They don't want to touch it. This is coming from Christians, people who claim to be Christians. He said in this poll, 54% are not convinced that there is absolute truth. Think about that. Over half of the people he polled who were Christians who go to church on a weekly basis believe that there's no absolute truth. Now let me ask you, if you read this right here, how can you say that there's no absolute truth if you believe this? If you say you believe this right here, then yes, there is absolute truth. Because it's this simple. Something can't be true and untrue at the same time. It's either true or it's not. It's that simple. So you've got over half of people he polled who are weekly Christians or weekly churchgoers. Oh, there's no thing as absolute truth. Does that look like a group set apart? It doesn't. We spend, this also in the poll, they spend 7 times more time before the television set than all spiritual pursuits. That means they don't come to any other kind of church services. They don't go to any kind of anything that has to do with the church at all. Some of you will spend an hour here today, some 2. We spend more time than that at church. Churches actually spend more time at church. Maybe that's why our early Christian leaders, maybe that's why they were making a difference. Because they put Christ before everything else. Go figure. That's what the book says. And then this one, I think this one's really telling. Discipleship is basically unknown in churches. He said 60% of all converts are not connected to any Christian body within 4 weeks of conversion. If we're going to be making disciples, we actually have to disciple them. So if you're a disciple, you need to be coming to church so that we can disciple you. If you're not coming, we can't disciple you. Or maybe that says you don't want to be discipled. Maybe you don't want to really be a disciple. Cal Thomas said this, why should the majority accept something they have not seen fully lived out by those who profess to believe? That's a good question. We're telling people out here that this right here is absolute truth, but yet we don't believe it fully because they can't even see it in us. Maybe that's why we're losing ground. So, here's the question. What does this have to do with Christianity? What does this Old Testament theme of being holy have to do with Christianity? What's that have to do with being a Christian? Well, you have to turn to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1, 13 through 16 says this. 1 Peter chapter 1, 13 through 16 says, therefore, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. Now that means the culture in which we lived before we were Christians, it said, you're not supposed to go back to that ignorance. Christ has called us for something else. He's called us for a different purpose. He goes on and says, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So here, Peter is taking directly what was said in Leviticus, what God said, and directing it to what Christ has done. It is directly related. That thing that you read in the Old Testament is just as relevant today as it was when God said it. And notice that it says conduct. You know, everything that we do in our life is a result of our conduct. So maybe we're not looking like a people set apart because our conduct is not looking like a people set apart. We don't look like we're that interested in following this Jesus, who we claim is the Son of God. But here's something I want you to notice about Jesus. Because there's an author by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He made a very good book, and I would suggest everybody read it. It's called The Cost of Discipleship. It's one of the greatest books that's ever been written. And one of the things he talks about is cheap grace. You say, well, if I sin, I can just, I know Jesus has forgiven me, so it's all good. I can just, he says that's cheap grace. He said, we ought to be a little better than that. We ought to not be treating what Jesus did on the cross and when he rose from the dead to give us new life, we shouldn't treat it so cheaply. Maybe that might be part of the reason why we're not touching culture. That might be the reason why we're losing ground. But here's what Jesus did. You notice Jesus didn't talk about us dying for our sins. He talked about us dying to sin. But he didn't talk about us dying for our sins. You know why? He did it. See, we can't do that. But I'll tell you what Jesus did talk about. He talked about righteous living. Conduct. That's exactly what the Old Testament talks about in the law. In the Old Testament, the law was not meant for people to be perfect, because nobody was going to be able to perfectly follow the law. It was impossible. It was intended to show the people that they couldn't do it on their own. Every aspect of the law, the sacrifice and all that thing, had to go before a high priest who had to make atonement for sin. Blood had to be shed. It was intended to show us we can't do it on our own. We can't do it by ourselves. There's somebody who's perfect, and he's already done it. But every aspect of the law, every aspect of our lives, of their life, it was intended to draw them closer to God and separate them from the sinfulness of the world around them. We are a people set apart. If we say that we belong to Jesus Christ, then we are a people set apart. And we should be showing that to everybody. People ought to be seeing that we are a people set apart. And it should be drawing us closer to God. Every Sunday, or every Wednesday, or every Thursday, or every time we gather together, you ought to be a little bit more Christian than you are right now. But your conduct gives you away. Because you act no different than you did however many years ago. That's not the mark of holiness. That's the mark of complacency. That's the mark of cheap grace. That's not what Christ requires. If we want to make a dent in the culture, if we want to draw the culture closer to God, then we have to live in such a way that it actually draws people closer to Christ. And draw people to live a holy life. And so here's the question and the challenge for you today. Are we living a holy life to Christ? That's your homework for this week. Let's stand for a closing prayer.